Big Séance Podcast, episode
47.
The Halloween episode.
Welcome to the Big Séance Podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the seance. Guess what, paranerds? We are just days, hours even, from All Hallows Eve. We've carved our pumpkins here. I've toasted the seeds. I've watched spooky movies. I've read another book on the topic of Halloween. And I'm starting to put my mind toward what shtick I'll be planning in a new neighborhood. I really have no idea, actually, so I need to get busy. But I do know I'll definitely make traditional Halloween chili, some hot apple cider, and at some point, probably play Monster Mash for fun, and maybe a Roseanne Halloween episode, if I can fit it in. No tricks today, but I do have a special treat. I invited several Big Séance Podcast family members to share spooky stories and thoughts of Halloween. With the exception of our first guest, these are friends who have been guests on the show between now and last Halloween. I'll pop in here and there, and at the end of the show, I'll be premiering what will be a new regular segment on the Big Séance Podcast and some other big news. And I'm very excited to share it with you. You can find information and links to guest websites in the show notes at bigseance.com, or you can probably find links right in this episode in your podcast app. You know, something else I noticed just the other day, my podcast, the timestamps for when I put the chapters in, you can click on the times, and it takes you right to that section. How cool is that? I don't even know how long it's been doing that, but I thought that was cool. At least in my podcast app, I use the Overcast app. I really like that one, so I guess it could just be in Overcast. So are you ready? Put the electronics away, except if you're playing this podcast on it, and cut the electricity and light a few candles. Grab a few Mary Janes, you know, those black and orange generically wrapped gooey Halloween candy from the good old days. I might be alone in saying this, but I loved those. Sorry, I got distracted again. Halloween candy does that to me. Here we go. First guest. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jim Harold is in the parlor. Happy Halloween, Jim.
Happy Halloween, Patrick. So good to be with you, and thank you for allowing me to spend some time with you and the Big Séance audience.
Oh, you're welcome. You know, every time I talk to Jim, I always tell him it's an Elvis moment for me, and one of these days, maybe I'll get to the point that I don't fanboy out when I talk to him.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Now, that's totally an overreaction, but very nice of you.
I was fortunate to have the chance to talk to Jim for a whole episode about a year ago, and that was, I think, episode 14. So I'll link you to that in the show notes. And if you are a new listener, I definitely recommend you go back and check that episode out. And in our last conversation, you were super excited to give us a sneak peek of your third Campfire book. It's a year later, and now there's a fourth Campfire book.
Yeah, I've just got this compulsion to put out a book every year at Halloween. Imagine that. But yeah, Campfire 4 is out, and so far it seems to be doing well and getting some good reviews, so we're excited about it. And 70 more spooky stories. Actually, the picture on the cover is a a flaming skeleton on a motorcycle. It's kind of like the theme is Campfire rides again. So we're back with 70 more stories.
And how perfect for this time of year. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it is. And the thing that I love is when people email me and say, hey, Jim, we were at a literal campfire or a family gathering, and we sat with the book and we told some stories out of the book. And then we start telling our own stories, and it kind of is a fire starter, if you will, to get the conversation going. And really glad that people continue to enjoy the podcasts and the books.
Well, I want you to share a story with us, but I have a special request for one. And as everyone probably knows by now, along with the paranormal, I'm a music nerd. And you have a story in this book about a seance. First of all, clearly something that, would catch the attention of my audience. But this seance just might involve the spirit of Karen Carpenter. Will you please spook us out with this one?
Yeah. First of all, I want to say, and I say this in the book, I've always liked the Carpenters. A lot of people consider them passé or kind of cheesy or kind of tacky, but I've never felt that way. I always thought that they were tremendously talented. Yeah, there was some of the 70s, early 70s stuff going on with their music, but Karen Carpenter, what a voice, what a talent who passed too soon. So when I got this story, and it's called A Kind of Hush, and if you're a Carpenters fan, you'll get the reference.
Can I throw in some of the traditional, crackling fire behind you as you tell this story?
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
The Jim Harold fire.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the fire would be good. So this A Kind of a Hush story, this really caught my attention when it came across. This is one of our listeners. She's from Washington State, and she told this story. It's Tracy. She told this story when she was a kid. She was a teenager. This is probably the early 80s, a little bit after Karen Carpenter passed. And they were playing around with a Ouija board, and they were very fond of the Carpenters' music. So they said, why don't we try to contact Karen Carpenter? Let's have a seance. So they didn't know what they were doing, but they said, let's give it a go. So they just mimicked what they saw on TV and movies. They went upstairs to a friend's bedroom. They sat on the mattress in a circle and held hands. Out loud, they said they wanted to speak with Karen Carpenter and to please use their energy and allow her to come through. And they had one of the albums playing quietly with a few candles lit. And the single door into the room was closed. And on the back of that door was a plastic bar that held one hanger. And on his holder, there was this hanger with no clothing on it. So they proceeded to do the seance and ask for Karen to come through. And all of a sudden, Tracy notices the hanger swaying back and forth. She said her one friend, who was her age, saw the hanger moving and was a little startled. But the two younger kids in the room started flipping out. She said they jumped off the bed, and she said her friend's little sister fainted right on the floor. Then her little brother, Tracy's little brother, started running for the window to jump out of the window. He was so startled. So obviously they had seen something. She stopped her brother from jumping out of the window. Thank goodness. He was in an absolute panic. And she said, we have to go through the door to get out. Just run through the door down the stairs. And they all did, except for the girl who fainted. They had to literally drag her down the stairs. And once they got to the living room, Tracy wanted to know, why were they so freaked out? What did they see? And the mom of the family wasn't there. She was due back in 15 minutes, so they had to get everybody calmed down. So basically, the little girl who fainted, they brought her to, and they said, what did you see? And she said, I saw a hand on the hanger, and the next thing I know, I was lying on the floor. And then Tracy looked at her brother and said, what did you see? And he said, I saw Karen Carpenter dancing. Tracy said, it gets worse. He said, Karen was holding the hanger with one hand, and she was dancing. And that was what was making the hanger sway. So they saw the hanger, but this boy, he saw, quote, Karen. He said that she was wearing a gauzy type flowing dress, and that she took her right leg and started to lift it up, but further than a human could possibly lift their leg at a weird angle. He said when he saw that, he was going to jump through the window. He wasn't even going to open it. He was going to go right through the glass. Thank goodness that he didn't. Now, they were all hysterical, and now there was 5 minutes till the mom came home. So the two younger ones wouldn't go upstairs, but Tracy and her friend had to get the candles blown out before Mom got home. So they crept up the stairs. And when they came around, it was interesting because the song was playing was There's a Kind of Hush. But all of a sudden there was a scratch on the record, so it go, there's a kind of hush, whir. There's a kind of hush, whir. There's a kind of hush. And it just kept repeating, Tracy said. She said all the hair was standing on her body and she had chills all over. They took the needle off the record, blew out the candles, and they were out of there. But here, I love this twist. So they kind of recovered. The mom came home, and the mom said something like, oh, you guys have been such good kids. I'm going to take you out for ice cream, having no idea that they had done all this and almost had a disaster. They got in the car. The mom starts the car. The radio is on. Now, mind you, this is not a cassette. There weren't even CDs in cars, I don't think, at that point, unless you were a millionaire. There was no cassette. There was no 8-track, if you remember that. This was the radio. And guess what was playing? There's a kind of hush all over the world tonight.
I am going straight to YouTube after we hang up, and I'm listening to that song.
And Tracy says, all of them were like, oh, my God, we asked her to change the station, and we just went to get our ice cream. So, I mean, I will say this, and I even worried about this. I mean, I'm a little old Jim Harold. They probably won't even know about it, but I didn't want to in any way offend the Carpenter family. I kind of think maybe this was an imposter spirit that was trying to have a little fun at the expense of our young seance makers. I don't necessarily think it was Karen Carpenter herself, but I thought it was a pretty freaky story and very unique, and I love to be able to put those unique stories in the Campfire books.
Well, and who knew that if this was Karen Carpenter, that she was a gymnast?
Exactly. Exactly.
Maybe that was the situation.
Yeah, but I'll tell you one thing. She was a vocal gymnast and a darn good singer, so may she rest in peace.
Absolutely. I love her music. Well, do you have time for another one? One more?
I do, and this is actually the last story in the book, and it's my favorite. And it's not a spooky, ooky story, but it does make you think, recently or coming up, I'm going to have you on, we recorded an interview for my show that you're on, and we talked about life after death. And I think this story hints at something. And I love these stories that come from people who are not necessarily purveyors of the paranormal. They're not investigators. They're not psychics. They're just people doing whatever it is they do, and the supernatural visits itself upon them. And again, not saying anything against those paranormal people, because I'm one of them. But I love it when we get something from a doctor, or a lawyer, a police officer, something like that, somebody doing their profession, and in the course of doing that job, something weird happens. And this one's called A Physician Meets the Supernatural. And another favorite thing from the Campfire show is we have people all over the world, and this gentleman, this physician, was from the United Kingdom. And basically, he was just breaking in as a doctor. He was kind of in his apprenticeship, very early days, so he was in the equivalent of their emergency ward. Kind of, somebody comes in and needs stitches, he's there to help. So anyway, there was I believe a code blue called, and he was called to help up on the 4th floor of the hospital. And he left what he was doing, took care of, finished with the patient he was with, ran up, and he was running up the stairs because this was a patient in distress, and he was called to help. And he gets about 3/4 up the stairs, and he sees a man walk out of the doors, double doors of one of the wards, and he's wearing a mint green T-shirt and nothing else. And it's an elderly man. And the doctor thought, well, I'm going to call the nurses on this floor, get them to come out and help this man. Maybe he has dementia or something. You see this kind of thing in hospitals, particularly with older people. So he calls out to the nurses, there's a man here, he needs assistance, he's not properly dressed or whatever. And he yells out, and he kind of disregards him and runs up to the next floor. And he goes into the room where he's to help this patient. And that's when he gets the surprise of his life. Because guess who that patient is? It is the man who just ran up the stairs. And this patient is flatlining, and they're trying to bring him back. And the other doctors are asking him, "What's going on, Dr. Farbod? You seem like something's wrong." And he snapped out of it and went to his job. And unfortunately, the man died. And he kept being a logical man. He tried to understand it. And he went back down to the ward thinking, well, maybe it was somebody with the same color T-shirt. Maybe I was just mistaken. He went and talked to the nurses. And they said that the only thing we were shaken up about was the fact that you came yelling that there was somebody out here because we came here and there was no one here. And Dr. Farbod basically said, I can't explain it. And it makes me think that there is more to life than just, and this is to use my phrase, but I often use more than we can weigh on a scale or measure in a test tube. And he says even in the practice of medicine, he sees people who have a good result because either their faith in medicine or their faith in faith. So he can't really discount that there's more to life than just the materialistic. And I thought that was such a poignant story and a great way to finish out the book, because I do believe there's more beyond this existence. I don't think it just all goes to black. I think there's something else. And I think certainly a story like this one heavily hints towards that.
It makes you wonder, too, like how many stories that medical professionals have like this, and they don't necessarily share them. It really makes me wonder, because they have to have a lot of stories like this, you would think.
Yeah, I think that a lot of these stories may go untold, or they may go untold to the extent that they may only be told in small circles, just to closest family members, closest friends. Because everybody, and I've often said this on the show, and I think you probably experience the same thing. You could talk to a skeptic, tell them what you do, tell them what you're interested in, and they say something like this: well, I'm not interested in that stuff at all, but there was this one time. And I think almost everybody has that one time. And again, I think that it hints to something legitimately going on. What it is, I don't know. But I'll tell you, in all of the books, in all the podcasts, the vast majority of people, I believe, are telling me what they believe to be true, what they believe happened to them.
Right.
And then for the books, I select a subset of the stories I think are most sincere. And that's probably the number one criteria, other than being an interesting story. Do I believe this person believes what they're telling me? And I don't put stories in where I think somebody's trying to snow me. So I hope that comes across in the podcast and the book.
Yeah, I think you do a great job curating those, and you've picked some good ones.
Well, thank you very much. And I hope that people enjoy the book. If they want to check it out, they can go to, the easy way to get it is you can go to Amazon, of course. What I've done is I've set up a special URL that will take you to a listing of all the books. And the nice thing about this series is you can pick up in book 4, you can pick up in book 1. It doesn't really make a difference. They're short stories and they're individually contained. So you could start with 4 and go work your way back, or vice versa. And that's at jimharoldbooks.com, JIMHAROLD books.com. And then if you have not heard my podcasts, Campfire or the Paranormal Podcasts, you can get a bunch of free podcasts over at jimharold.com. And then again, of course, you can find the books at Amazon, both in Kindle and paperback. I recommend go for the Kindle. It's only $2.99, and you could buy all 4 for the cost of what it would cost you to buy one paperback. It might be, no, that's right, $12. You can have 280 stories, and that's less than the cost of one paperback. Now, some people love paperback, and that's also an option for them as well.
Well, I think everyone listening surely by now knows this, but people have to know that if it weren't for Jim Harold's Paranormal Podcast back from the beginning, they certainly would not be listening to the Big Séance right now, and a lot of paranormal nerdiness coming out of me would not have happened if it weren't for your direct influence. So I appreciate that. And I really want to thank you for, joining me again, because it's an honor.
Well, thank you. And I'm so glad that it's gone so well for you. Continued success. And I just see it getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And again, any small role I played in it, I was glad to do. And I'm glad to see you doing so well. And thank you for letting me spend a little time with you and your audience tonight.
No problem. You rock. Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween!
My next guest reminds us that sometimes, when dealing with the paranormal, things can get truly frightening, and sometimes dark energy just finds its way into our world. But this story has a happy ending.
Hi Patrick, it's Clair Broad, and I'm a medium, teacher and public speaker in the UK. I'm also a fan of your show, and you kindly had me on episode 38 of the Big Séance. This time I'm sharing with you a true story. It starts in the daytime when, as usual for me, a client visited my home for a sitting. She was a lovely lady, but as I opened to read for her, I realised her inner state of being did not reflect her outer. This poor lady had suffered her fair share of heartache, depression and loss. As I connected with the love of the spirit world, they gave me such strong evidence of survival and healing for this lady that she was afforded great peace of mind. When she left my home, I remember thinking to myself how much better she looked. Physically, it was like a huge weight had lifted off her shoulders. Her face looked younger, less tired and drawn. I didn't give it any more thought than that. Fast forward to the evening then, and I'm getting ready for bed. I notice that it starts to fall eerily quiet around me. As a mother, when you have children, the sound of silence is always ominous, so I decided to check on them one last time. As soon as I had this thought, there in front of me appeared two red eyes. I was so tired though, I put this down to tiredness and I shrugged it off. I heard my youngest daughter then beginning to cry in her sleep. She was mumbling, having a nightmare. As I neared the door to her bedroom, my heart stopped in my chest. My daughter's toys took on a life of their own. She was a toddler at the time, and one of her favourites was a farmyard that made animal sounds. I heard this toy playing music and making sheep and cow sounds. Still rationalising this away, however, I put it down to low battery life and rushed into the room to take it out so it wouldn't wake her. However, as soon as I entered the room, my heckles went up. Other toys that were battery powered too joined in the cacophony. In particular, one ball that had buttons on it that lit up when you pressed them randomly lit up and started very slowly rocking on the floor. To say I was immobilised is an understatement. I watched in half astonishment and half horror. My daughter, who was still fast asleep, now started speaking, saying things like, "Go away and leave me alone." That forced me into action. I sprang into professional mode. I stood in the middle of the room and opened my senses to the non-physical. As I did this, the temperature in the room plummeted, and that's when I knew it. I was dealing with some kind of energy here. Not really knowing what it was, I sent out affirmations. In a mother's love, you will leave this place. In a mother's love, you are not welcome here. In a mother's love, you cannot return. You cannot exist here. And what I did was purely instinctual. Whilst I did this, in my mind's eye, I visualised flooding the room with light and wrapping my daughter in my love. It was then that I saw it. Firstly, it looked like a shapeless black mass, and then I realised that it had taken on the form of an animal, which I perceived to be dog-like. But whatever it was, it made a dash for the bedroom door, but not before making sure it passed straight through me. My blood seemed to pool as it passed through, as if it was trying to drag the life force out of me from my head to my feet. I physically had a reaction. I felt dizzy, disorientated and sick to my stomach. I had to gather my senses, and I tuned back in and realised my house was clear. This thing had gone. I glanced over at my daughter and she stopped crying. She rolled over in her bed and went back to peaceful sleep. I wish I could say the same for me, however. It took me a long time to go off to sleep that night as I mulled it over. I realised that in having affected such a positive change in my client in the daytime, that in some way she'd actually dropped the pain and negativity she'd been carrying and whatever may have been attracted to that in my house. It may sound like a crazy theory to some, but to me it was obvious that power, that negativity, it had a life of its own. Every now and then I wonder what happened to that dark energy. I hope it's relegated back to the lower levels where it belongs, but strangely I also blessed that experience. It taught me that light and dark do coexist in this world, and that always love conquers all.
Thank you, Claire. I think we all sighed with relief at the end of your story. For more on Claire, visit clairbroad.com. Next up is a memorable voice from episodes 20 and 21 of the Big Séance Podcast. Edwin F. Becker shared his memories of a frightening, true haunting. I highly recommend you listen to that 2-part interview and pull the blanket up and tuck it under your neck. Today, he shares another true haunting with us, this time a story he's never told before.
Let me die. Let me die.
This is Edwin F. Becker, author of True Haunting, and I can be reached at www.edwinbecker.com. What I'm about to tell you is a story that's never been told, and it was likely my first paranormal experience ever. But at the time, I didn't know it. The year was 1960, and I was the product of a very dysfunctional family. So I had lived my youth between living with my mother and my violently abusive alcoholic father. At the time, I was living with my mother, and my favorite aunt came, and she picked us up out of the inner city of Chicago and brought us out to Addison, Illinois, where she lived. Now, I had a cousin who was my exact age, and my mom, my aunt, and my little brother and sister decided they were going to go out shopping and left my cousin and I alone, watching TV and goofing around as 14-year-olds do. The house was a small 2-bedroom house, and we sat in the front room watching television and goofing around and joking. It was a cold, dark January night with a light snow leaving about an inch on the ground. We were in the process of watching a television program when all of a sudden the back door, which was an aluminum storm door, began violently shaking and as if someone were banging to get in. Not knowing my cousin's friends or what the social arrangements were in Addison, he got up and he went to the back door, and when he came back, he had this very confused look on his face, and I asked him who it was, and he said there was nobody there. We continued watching TV, and about 5 minutes later, again, the back door started shaking and violently making noise as if someone were breaking in. So this time we both got up and went to the back door. And I noticed that not only was there no one there were no footprints in the snow. So now it became a bit creepy for the both of us. We went back in the front room and were watching TV, and not 10 minutes later, the front door, which was located in the front room, started shaking and violently making noise and crashing, and we absolutely thought at this time, someone's breaking in. So we were frightened, we ran, we looked for weapons to defend ourselves, and within a minute or so, it all stopped. When we lost our fear and went to look outside, we found again there were no footprints in the snow. And it was 1960. We had no frightening images to imagine, but we did think that something was definitely wrong, and we were experiencing something highly unusual. We sat there, no longer able to watch TV and relax, sort of apprehensive and anxious until my aunt came home with my mother a few minutes later, at which time she said, "Ed, please sit down. I want to tell you something." She said, "Your father died about an hour ago." I sat in shock. Well, it wasn't until years later and I became experienced in the paranormal that I reflect on this. And to this day, I will always wonder, was that my father coming to tell me his final goodbye? This is Edwin F. Becker, www.edwinbecker.com.
These next special paranerds need no introduction from me.
This is Diane.
And this is Denise.
From the History Goes Bump podcast.
Happy Halloween, everybody.
We're so excited to be here with the Big Séance Podcast listeners. Our specialty is haunted history, and since we are from Central Florida, we thought we would share a bit of lore and haunting from our area with you guys.
In the early 1900s, a farmer named Al Hawkins bought a parcel of land off of Interstate 4. This route travels between Daytona and Tampa, and one spot along this intersection is affectionately called the Dead Zone.
This site was originally a Swedish settlement named St. Joseph's Colony. Father Felix Prosper Swemberg led the colony, but only 4 immigrant families ever settled there. The father left, and yellow fever swept through and decimated the small colony. 4 members from one of the families died, and unfortunately, there was no one there to give them a proper burial. Their graves were dug in the woods and forgotten to time, until Farmer Al came along.
Farmer Al decided to clear the overgrown fields when he came upon 4 small, rotting wood crosses. The farmer decided to leave that area alone. It remained a peaceful spot until the farmer died in 1939. And then the legend about the Dead Zone began. A rusty wire fence remained around the graves, and when the new landowner removed the fence, his house burned down. A young boy tampered with one of the graves by digging it up. He was killed by a drunk driver the very next day.
In 1959, the government bought the Hawkins property in order to build Interstate 4. The engineers decided that it was not important to move the graves, and they plowed them over. Shortly after that, Hurricane Donna ripped through southern Florida, and here's where things get really weird. The hurricane changed paths and followed the line of the proposed new Interstate 4. It stopped construction for a month and was the worst Central Florida had seen in a long time.
Deaths began to happen in this area that is located in Seminole County at the south end of the Interstate Bridge across the St. Johns River. A tractor-trailer hauling shrimp went off the highway and killed the driver. It was the first of an estimated 1,700 car crashes in this area. And as for ghosts, there are sightings of pioneer ghosts standing near the highway.
Dark, shadowy figures walk along the highway as well. Radios seem to pick up on ghostly voices crackling with messages like, "Who's there?" and "Why?" Cell phones go dead when passing through the zone, and the disembodied voices of girls giggling can be heard.
Is this area of I-4 really the Dead Zone? Is this highway haunted? That is for you to decide.
Afraid of the dark? That's just silly. What you should be afraid of is the thing that watches you sleeping.
I want to thank Diane and Denise for their amazing contribution to this episode. I know many of you are also fans of their show, The History Goes Bump. They're having a great year. Their interview on the Big Séance Podcast was episode 40 from September 3rd, 2015. And I was honored to recently be asked to be a part of their Halloween Roundtable episode that has probably been released by this point, but if not, you'll be able to check that one out soon at historygoesbump.com. Thanks, ladies. Next up, just recently I got to have another conversation with Carole J. Obley, who is a spiritual medium and author, and she was on episode 27 of the podcast on February 5th, 2015. Today, Carole wanted to share with us a few experiences she has had with seeing ectoplasm. You certainly don't hear about ectoplasm much anymore. It's fascinating. Here's Carole.
About 20 years ago, I lived in an older home, and it's not far from where I live now. And it was probably built, I would say, in the 1920s. And I lived there for a total of 7 years. And the first 4 to 5 years were just average time living there. Nothing out of the ordinary happened. And I never really even thought about that, living in this place. But after I'd lived there for about 5 years or so, we started having a very peculiar sense and actually seeing ectoplasm. And for those who are listening who don't know what that is, ectoplasm is kind of a smoky, filmy, white substance. It really does look like cigarette smoke. And so one day I was there by myself, and I was watching TV, and I was running a tabletop press. I used to take in, ironing and pressing for people before I became a medium, so I did a lot of physical type of work. And I was standing there and by myself, and I'm running this press, and out of the corner of my eye, I see what appeared to be like a smoke ring, like someone had, blown a smoke ring, and it kind of floated by my right side. And I looked at it, and there was sunlight streaming through the window, and I thought, that's really odd. I wonder what that is. At first I thought, well, maybe it's a hair kind of floating through the air, and the sunlight caught it a certain way. And so I didn't think a whole lot more about that. But then in the days after that, there was other phenomena that happened, and very, very peculiar things. I've always had dogs, and at the time that this incident occurred, I had a couple of dogs, and they had the little dog beds that you keep on the floor. And one day I was there again by myself. My roommate was not there, and I was taking a bath, and so I left the bathroom door open, and it was an old-fashioned bathtub on legs. And I was just sitting there relaxing and soaking, and I happened to look out into my living room, and right above my miniature dachshund, who was laying in her bed, one of these dog beds on the floor, I saw this kind of small whitish cloud of smoke hovering over top of her. And I thought, am I really seeing that? What the heck is that? And it just kind of hovered there, and she was resting and sleeping and didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. And so I saw that happen several times. So I really started to feel and sense that there was something up in this old place. But the night that really clinched it was about 8 o'clock one evening. I went into the same bathroom that I was talking about, and I was brushing my teeth. And I'm standing at the sink, and all of a sudden, right in front of me, out of the wall comes a sizable cloud of ectoplasm. And it just came right in front of me, and I stepped back. I was so startled and amazed and afraid. I just stood there and looked at it, and then it dissipated, and it went back into the wall. And I just my mouth is full of toothpaste. I'm standing there, looking in the mirror, and I thought, did I really just see that? So I hurried up, I rinsed out my mouth, and my roommate was home, and I went to her and I said, you'll never believe what just happened in the bathroom. And she turned around to me and she said, that's our resident ghost. And she says, I have seen him before, and I've seen him wearing a suit. It was a black gentleman. And she said, well, he's shown me his hands, and they were quite weathered and scarred. And she said, I think he had been a slave. So I never saw him clairvoyantly. I never saw him in that state that she was describing. But he would produce very strange phenomena. For example, one night I was there, and the smell of whiskey came through the living room. And I do not drink. I haven't drank in many years, over 30 years. But the room filled up with the smell of whiskey. And then another day, we both smelled cigarette smoke. No one was smoking. So it was very scary. And one night I said, I don't want to live like this. I'm afraid to even get up in the middle of the night if I have to go to the restroom or whatever, or just to walk about the house. And so I asked this gentleman to leave. And he had said to my friend that lived there, he said, I don't want to be deceased. I still want to be in the land of the living. And that's why I'm here. So after I asked him and put out the intent, and I actually spoke to him out loud and said, please leave. You're frightening us, and you're scaring my dogs. We really don't want you here. Please go to the light. The phenomena stopped, and since that day, I have not seen anything there. Of course, I've moved out, and I also have had right after that an experience in the new place I lived. I had a shadow person that came in, and a very tall woman, but appeared completely different than the ectoplasm. She was dark, and it was much like seeing a shadow, and startled me. Used to produce very strong, bad odors. And again, I said, I don't want this in my house, and I asked her to leave, and she did. So far, knock on wood, in my new home, I haven't had any hauntings, but I have got impressions here. And so everything is peaceful now, but I'm here to tell you that I'm very genuine and legitimate, and ghosts do exist.
And you'll get no argument from me on that point, Carole. Thank you so much for another great conversation. You can find more on Carole at soulvisions.net. Well, no Halloween episode of the Big Séance Podcast would be complete without some wisdom from Karen A. Dahlman. When she shared this wisdom with me this evening, I told her that what she gave us was truly a gift. The message could not be more fitting and more for this audience. I think you'll see what I mean. Here's Karen.
Hello, Big Séance Podcast listeners. This is Karen Dolman, and I'm back to share with you some information about Halloween, of course. So what are you going to be doing for Halloween? Are you going to be enjoying it with spooky trick-or-treaters? Are you going to be watching scary movies or reading a good scary book? Hopefully you'll be listening to this podcast and hearing all the stories that are being shared. Well, I'm going to share something a little different with you today. I want to talk about this auspicious time, how perfect it is when the veil between the worlds of the living and dead has thinned, and what a great time to do spirit communication. It's a time to honor our ancestors, to honor our loved ones who have passed on, to honor our pets who have died. It's a time when we can reach into the other realm a lot easier than any other time. And it's time for us to be in honor of this holiday, of this space, of this energy of Halloween. So I'm going to suggest, if you don't use a board like I do, which of course you can bet I'll be using the board on Halloween, which is what I do pretty much every year for the last several years. But if you don't use a board, there are other ways to make contact with the dead. And so one way you can do this is get out a piece of paper, write down memories of the deceased loved one you want to connect with. Write down a few things about them you liked, what you remember about them, how they helped you. Just kind of make it alive in your mind. You only have to write down about 5 or 10 things. And then write down a question or a couple of questions you would like to ask this person. And after you do so, take that piece of paper, set it on your nightstand next to your bed. And the reason for this is, so when you go to sleep on Halloween night, you program yourself, you program your brain, your mind, to allow yourself to open up to the possibility of making contact. So you read your piece of paper you wrote out earlier in the day, you read your questions and put it back down and go to sleep. Now, the cool thing about when we sleep is that we're a lot less inhibited. So we don't have that normal chatter going on in our brain about things to do, lists to keep, people to see, phone calls to make, obligations to take care of, bills to pay. Instead, when we sleep, we have an ability to let all that go. And the deceased can reach us most easily through our dream. They can reach our consciousness, our awareness through our dream state. So don't be surprised if you have a dream that somehow relates to those questions you asked. Now, on the other hand, too, after you've already programmed those questions into your mind and you're wanting to make that contact, also be aware of synchronistic things that happen throughout the days that follow. You very well might find your answer to those questions or a message from that loved one in some kind of synchronistic manner. It might be through a piece of paper you find on the ground. It might be through the back of a license plate. Believe me, I get a lot of messages on license plates in the back of cars. It might be on a billboard. It might be overhearing a part of a conversation. You hear somebody sharing with another. But pay attention to that, because there will be some kind of resolution to those questions and some kind of answer. Now, if you're going to use the board, this is a great time to use the board because, again, the veil's thinner. That is at least how the legend goes, how the stories go, so I'm going to believe it and I'm sticking to it. And no matter what you end up doing for Halloween, whether you are going to be alone or with friends and family or the children, I wish you a very happy Samhain, a very happy All Hallows Eve, and a very, very happy Halloweeny. Thank you again for listening. Bye.
And for more on Karen, check out one of several Big Seance episodes that she has contributed to, or just visit KarenADahlman.com. Well, if you go back to episode number 22 from November 25th, 2014, you'll find an interview I did with author Tim Prasil. He has a fascinating new book titled Help for the Haunted, a decade of Vera Van Slyke ghostly mysteries. I don't want to go into what makes this book so fascinating, because if you haven't heard of Tim or the book, I want you to check it out. But if you follow Tim or any of his online work, chances are you're familiar with the character of Vera Van Slyke. Well, as Tim and I were trying to decide just how he could best contribute to this Halloween episode, a new regular segment was born. Or semi-regular segment, for sure. Tim calls it the Spectral Edition. I'm excited to present this first one with you, and so I'm going to let Tim do his thing and tell you all about it. Tim?
Thank you, Patrick. Welcome to Spectral Edition, in which I read actual ghost reports published in U.S. newspapers between the years of 1865 and 1918. I have an article here that sounds a little bit like a folk tale, but it was an article published in the Banner Democrat, a newspaper from Louisiana. It was published on April 17th, 1897. The title is Molly Magruder's Ghost. The ghost of Molly Magruder, who was killed near 7th and Tracy Streets about a year ago by William McCoy, still appears to frighten those who have to pass along that way in the early morning hours, writes a Kansas City correspondent. As stated in these dispatches 2 weeks ago, the woman first appeared to the keeper of a saloon on the corner of Independence and Lydia Avenues and appeared to be asking for a bucket of beer. She then appeared to several passers-by and to a policeman who, since that time, has never had occasion to get near the spot where the murder was committed. The publication in a morning paper here of the fact that such an apparition had been seen caused a number of people to go in that neighborhood on such nights as they happened to be out late in the hope of being able to see the spirit. The result is that there are now not less than 7 people who declare that they saw the ghost of the murdered woman, and while she invariably has the appearance of wanting to reveal something, no one has yet had nerve enough to stay to hear her story. The latest tale is from a man who had heard nothing about the ghost and who had occasion to cut across Lydia Avenue about 2 o'clock one morning recently. The gentleman was hurrying through the dark street when his attention was attracted by a woman who was standing perfectly erect near a telegraph pole about 10 feet from a street lamp. She stood so still and looked at him so intently that he thought she might be a man who was dressed as a woman for the purpose of robbery, and, drawing his revolver, he approached her with the intention of asking what she was doing there at that time of night. She was in full view, but as the man got near to the telegraph pole, the woman seemed to dissolve in thin air and left no trace behind her. The gentleman thought it strange, and it was only when he related his story next morning that he found that he had approached Molly McGruder's ghost. I'm Tim Prasil. If you enjoyed this story, I have over 200 more, and I post one each weekend on my website. The website's name is Vera Van Slyke, Ghostly Mysteries. And now back to Patrick.
Thank you, Tim. Isn't that exciting? I can't wait for the next Spectral Edition. And as Tim said, you can find many others on his site.
You're listening to the Big Séance Podcast with Patrick Keller. Look for us on iTunes and be sure to check out bigseance.com for more discussion.
Before you run off to light your jack-o'-lantern or answer the door for trick-or-treaters, you know, I just read an article that predicts you are going to see a ton of little Elsas from Disney's Frozen this year. I can already see the drinking games forming. Apple cider, of course. Anyway, sorry, I was distracted again. Before you run off to do any spooky Halloween activities, I want to say thank you to 3 fabulous paranerds who wrote beautiful reviews of the podcast on iTunes. As you know, reviews on iTunes are like magic. These reviews came from Cheri, Xang, I'm just guessing it's Xang, it's Xang, and Denise. And I'm not going to read these 3 interviews because it will make me sound incredibly conceited. However, I just want to say that Xang says, also, the host has the best voice I have ever heard. Well, thank you very much. You know what's even more magical than reviews? Subscribes. If you haven't subscribed in iTunes or a podcast app, or if you haven't subscribed to your friends, please do. And you know what? Big news broke just this week in the podcast world. I'm not sure if you heard or not, but for Android users, this is big. Google Play is finally jumping into the world of podcasts. Right now, they've only just announced it, but you can be sure that I'm going to do my homework and follow the proper steps to make sure the Big Séance Podcast is available there for you. Pretty cool, huh? Up until now, it has been pretty challenging for Android users to easily subscribe and listen to podcasts. That's what I hear anyway. Exciting news, so stay tuned and I'll keep you posted.
Laughter professional language, and the clown with fits of laughter. But where does the gaiety disappear to when the festival is over? The circus ended, the carnival closed for the night. What happens to the droll man in the ridiculous costume? Usually his only function is to make us laugh. It is certainly not to disturb the secure curtain of reality.
The spooky music you've been hearing once again throughout this episode is the music of the very talented Sam Haynes. He's always very kind to give me permission to use it, and along with several albums that he has out that I listen to every year to get in the mood, he has a new album for this year called The Incredible Dark Carnival. You should check it out on iTunes or visit the Sam Haynes site at www.hauntmusic.co.uk. I know he's listening, so thank you, sir. Well, I hope you have a super spooky Halloween. And don't be too bummed when you wake up on November 1st and it's all over. But I bet if you're like me, you find a way to stretch Halloween just a little bit longer. And oh, how nice is it going to be falling back and setting those clocks back an hour on Halloween night. Many of us get to do that anyway. I am so sleeping in. Thanks for listening. You all rock. For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com, now the home of both the blog and the podcast. Just click on the Big Séance Podcast logo or find it in the menu. You can also find and subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher. Do you have any comments or feedback? Please contact me at patrick@bigseance.com. You can call my feedback line at 7755-TELL-ME. You can also record audio feedback right from the site using the SpeakPipe link included in the show notes. I could decide to include your voice in a future show. Thank you so much for listening and reading. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time.
Look.